Good morning. Before I forget, I will pass these around. And we'll say, since I gave up eating sweet foods for this season in these 40 or so days leading up to Easter, I've been a little bit cranky. Perhaps not as cranky as I would have been if I gave up meat or caffeine, but a little bit cranky, and I confess that to you this morning. I'll talk about in just a moment how I deal with some of that crankiness, but as a reminder, we are in the season leading up to Easter. And we are in the last couple of weeks before that. I know, I'm going to have myself a huge donut at the end of all this, although Sundays don't count. Sundays are not to fast, they are to feast, so I get to have a donut on Sunday at least. But in these last couple of weeks leading up to Easter, there is still the reminder of what this period is for and what ultimately Easter is, which is the day of resurrection, certainly. But we would not have the day of resurrection without the Friday before Easter and the cross that is there. And so part of why I fast from sweets and other folks fast from other things is to remind ourselves that the way of Jesus is the way of the cross. And while we may not take up a literal cross, what we can at least do is to imitate Jesus in the ways that we can by giving things up and or by reminding ourselves, for example, that we are dust, and to dust we return. I'm going to be returning to this theme in just a moment, along with this idea of Jesus as friend, whom we may or may not recognize as such. But before we do that, would you please turn with me, and for this morning it will need to be either in your physical Bibles or electronically, to the book of John, chapter 12. My apologies that we do not have the slides for that this morning. But open with me, if you would, to the book of John, chapter 12, and we'll be reading verses 1 through 8. John 12, 1 through 8. Hear the word of the Lord. 6 days before the Passover, Jesus came to Bethany, the home of Lazarus, whom he had raised from the dead. If you remembered back to October, we were in that very passage in John 11. There they gave a dinner for him. Martha, Lazarus' sister, one of Lazarus' sisters, served, and Lazarus was one of those at the table with him, with Jesus. Mary, Lazarus' other sister, took a pound of costly perfume made of pure nard, anointed Jesus' feet, and wiped them with her hair. And the house was filled with the fragrance of the perfume. But Judas Iscariot, one of the disciples, and the one who was about to betray Jesus, said, "Why was this perfume not sold for 300 denarii, and the money given to the poor?" This was about a month's wages. He said this not because he cared about the poor, but because he was a thief. And he kept the common purse and used to steal what was being put into it. And Jesus said, "Leave her alone. She bought it so that she might keep it for the day of my burial. You will always have the poor with you, but you do not always have me." The word of the Lord. What we see here, I suggest, is a case of both recognizing and misrecognizing. One of the ways that I've dealt with the crankiness of my lack of sweets in my life is to go on a little social media site known as Reddit and to scroll through the endless number of cat videos and funny posts And I noticed this one section of Reddit has this collection of basically instances of people being misrecognized. One of them, for example, has to do with the singer Dave Matthews. He's being interviewed in a park because you have to be outside during the height of COVID, and a couple approaches him and the interviewer and asks them to help move furniture into their new house. So they help them out for about a half hour and go off. The interviewer gets their phone number and later on gives them a call and asks, so do you know the singer Dave Matthews? And the couple said, yeah, we just were at his concert. Why? Misrecognizing who these folks are. Another, and this apparently happens really often, is the professional skater Tony Hawk. He and his two sons go to get a COVID test, and as the person taking their names is going through it, she says, Anthony Hawk, are y'all related to Tony Hawk? And he goes, why yes, all three of us are directly related to Tony Hawk. My favorite, though, might be a possibly apocryphal, we're not sure, it's not confirmed, but this instance in which a group of tourists in England go up to this house, which happened to be one of the Queen's private residences. And she was there at the time, and through the gate or something like that, they ask her, so have you ever met the Queen? And she says no, points to a policeman not too far away from them and says, but she has, and they go to the police to talk to them. My very favorite, though, is a video in which a ukulele player starts playing a song in a resort in Hawaii, not realizing that the artist who wrote the song was actually in front of him and started singing along. Sometimes someone's true qualities can be qualities, or rather, somebody's true qualities can be right in front of us, and we fail to see them for what they are. In John, the book that we just read from, people are often misrecognizing Jesus, or at least they misunderstand him. We're told this from the very first chapter, which says that the light came into the world, and the light shines in the darkness, and the darkness did not, some translations say overcome it, some translations say does not comprehend it. The word can go either way in Greek. John likes words that can go either way. Throughout this book, we find people who comprehend Jesus and those who don't, those who see and those who are blind, insiders and outsiders. Jesus turns water into wine at the Feast of Cana in chapter 2, and the groom is the one who gets the credit for bringing out good wine. He has a heart-to-heart talk with a religious leader in chapter 3 and is taken for an odd teacher who says things like, you must be born again, or born from above. It can go either way with John, which is an even odder thing to say, by the way. He gives a speech to religious leaders in chapter 8, and they think that he's a heretic, something about being before Abraham. It doesn't help, again, that in the original language, John likes to use these double entendres, which is a fancy French word or French term, meaning words or phrases that can go either way. Jesus gets misrecognized a lot in this book, even more so than Tony Hawk. It's striking then when someone does recognize who Jesus is and who does recognize in this book what he's saying. And it's not always who you might expect. You have the woman at the well in chapter 4 who goes to get her daily jug of water and goes back telling other people about the one she has just met. You have the blind man in chapter 9 who starts the story literally blind and by the end of it can actually see the Prince of Glory standing before him. You see this most dramatically with Lazarus in chapter 11, who through the gloom of death hears the voice of the Good Shepherd and responds by coming toward it. These are the people in the Gospel of John who get it, who hear the double entendre, this thing that can go either way, and they hear it the right way, if you will. These are the people who recognize that they're in the presence of someone who's more than they thought. These are the true insiders, and they're sometimes surprising. Our story is about recognizing and misrecognizing. The one who misrecognizes and who misunderstands Jesus is the one who spent the most time with Jesus, the one who's been a disciple, who's listened to the speeches and seen the miracles and heard Jesus talk about who he is and where he's going, that Jesus is the Son of God and that his road is the one to the cross. Granted, this is Judas Iscariot we're talking about. And this text that we just read questions his status as an insider, or at least his priorities. And later on, by the way, when Judas goes out to betray Jesus, he does so at night, showing just how in the dark he truly is. The one who does recognize Jesus in our text here is the one who hasn't played a major role in the story to this point. It's Mary, who is characterized by her relationships: sister of Lazarus, sister of Mary, Martha, disciple of Jesus. And what's striking is that she recognizes about Jesus: that he is worthy of adoration and that he is on the road to the cross. Now it's funny how the one who truly recognizes Jesus is, just as we sang, the one who takes him at his word. So how about us? How well do we recognize Jesus? Very frankly, I think it's hard to recognize Jesus in the culture that we live in here in the West and in the U.S. in particular. Think about all of the ways in which you've been invited to view Jesus in the last week, other than the Son of God and other than one who is on the road to the cross. Perhaps it was simply as Jesus as moral teacher, who says a bunch of things that are good but is on par with all the other moral teachers. Perhaps he's a motivator, one who gets you out of bed in the morning and helps you to do your best, to live your best life now. Maybe you've seen him, and perhaps not in these words, but more as a bro or a friend, the buddy Jesus, if you will. Or in a way that I think is actually quite a bit more sinister, perhaps you've been invited to see him as the conqueror who is on our side, who flattens all the others around. It's not easy, I think, where we live to recognize Jesus. And a follow-up question to that is, how well do we follow Jesus? Because it's one thing to recognize Jesus. It can be another to follow, especially when that road leads to the cross. There's a Filipino theologian by the name of Eliezer Fernandez, who says that perhaps instead of asking the traditional question of who is Jesus, something that Jesus himself asks, who do you say that I am? He says perhaps it is sometimes important to also ask the question of where is Jesus? Whose side is Jesus on? Fernandez contrasts, if you will, a couple of different emphases, those who emphasize the divine Jesus and those who emphasize the human Jesus, two sides of the same coin. And he says that while the appropriate response to the divine Jesus is to worship, the appropriate response to the human Jesus is to follow. But if you've got Jesus as he appears in the Gospel of John, who is both the Son of God and also the one who can be killed by a cross, the real question is this one. Once you recognize who Jesus is, will you still follow? Now let me pause and be really clear about what I'm saying here. Because I'm not talking about someone who is seeking suffering. I'm not talking about someone who is simply accepting abuse. Following Jesus, whose way is the way to the cross doesn't mean that you have to simply accept the abusive relationship or the toxic work environment or fill in the blank here and claim that it is following Jesus. In fact, I would suggest to you that to claim to do that is to follow the title of a book that a professor of mine once assigned for the Gospel of John, which is an adventure in missing the point. The point here, and by the way, even the martyrs of the 1st through the 3rd century of Christianity themselves did not seek martyrdom. It was only as a last resort that they said, well, it looks like I'm a martyr now. Seeking martyrdom and seeking suffering is not what it means to follow Jesus on the way to the cross. So what does it mean? What does following this Jesus look like? I thought hard about an example that I could give of a single person or community that I know, and I couldn't find just the right example for it. And so, if you will, I'd like to give several examples of people whose names I won't mention, and in some cases that I don't know, but whose actions speak that they are on the way to the cross, and maybe give an example of what it could look like. And I invite you to think of your own as well. It might look like taking the $10,000 that you saved to build a new deck and instead taking it and giving it to the missionary whose work that you believe in. It may look like speaking against injustice that preys on the most vulnerable people at your workplace, even at the risk of your own job. It may look like raising a child or helping to raise one with the empathy to listen to stories that are not our own. Fill in the blank. You're probably thinking of other examples, even as I name these. So what will you do here in the last weeks leading up to Easter to recognize who Jesus is? Jesus is a friend, certainly, but do we recognize the kind of friend that he is? That he can be at the same time friend and Son of God and on the way to the cross. And if we follow him, what will our following look like?